June 10, 1942, 6:47 p.m. Flight deck, USS Enterprise, CV-6, 240 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Aviation Ordnanceman 3rd Class Bruno Guido stood on the starboard catwalk, watching the evening patrol return. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, the sun setting behind scattered clouds. The carrier steamed into the wind at 27 knots, creating the relative wind speed needed for aircraft recovery operations. Guido counted aircraft. 12 SBD Dauntless dive bombers had launched on the final patrol. 12 should return. He watched as the first Dauntless entered the landing pattern, gear down, hook extended, approaching from astern. The aircraft carrier's landing signal officer, standing on his platform at the port quarter, guided the aircraft with paddle signals, bringing it down toward the arresting wires stretched across the deck. Then Guido saw it, a 13th aircraft, following the landing pattern but maintaining separation from the Dauntlesses. The silhouette was wrong. The aircraft was smaller, leaner, with a distinctive greenhouse canopy that caught the setting sun. Not an SBD, not any American aircraft he recognized. For perhaps 3 seconds, his mind refused to process what his eyes saw. Then recognition arrived with the cold certainty of nightmare made real. Mitsubishi A6M Zero, Japanese carrier fighter, enemy aircraft. Following the landing pattern, gear down, hook extended, attempting to land on an American carrier. What happened in the next 90 seconds would become one of the most surreal incidents in the Pacific War, an event so improbable that witnesses would doubt their own memories, an occurrence that revealed how confusion, exhaustion, and the chaos of war could create moments where enemies acted with perfect coordination despite themselves. This is the story of the Japanese pilot who landed on an American carrier by accident, survived, and provided intelligence that would shape American naval aviation for years. But more fundamentally, it's the story of how war creates absurdities that peacetime minds struggle to comprehend. How young men trained to kill each other could find themselves face to face in circumstances where violence seemed almost inappropriate. And how a single navigational error, compounded by exhaustion and desperation, led to one of the most extraordinary prisoner captures in naval history. The mathematics of aerial navigation suggested that such errors were inevitable. Pilots operating at the limit of fuel endurance, without reliable navigation aids, over featureless ocean where every square mile looked identical to every other. But mathematics didn't prepare anyone for the specific form this particular error would take. To understand how a Japanese pilot came to land on USS Enterprise, you need to understand the operational tempo that it pushed both Japanese and American naval aviation to the breaking point in the weeks following the Battle of Midway. June 4–6, 1942, Battle of Midway. The Imperial Japanese Navy's first air fleet, the carrier strike force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, was destroyed. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were sunk by American dive bombers. The cream of Japanese naval aviation, pilots with hundreds of combat hours, died when their carriers burned and sank. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific was shattered. But the destruction wasn't total. The Japanese Second Fleet centered on the light carrier Zuho, and the cruisers of Cruiser Division 8 had operated on the flanks of the main battle. When the 4 fleet carriers were lost, these forces withdrew northward, conducting fighting retreats against American pursuit forces. Among the pilots operating from Zuho was Flight Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Narusawa, a 23-year-old Zero pilot with 18 months of service and approximately 350 combat flight hours. Narusawa had flown in the Pearl Harbor attack, the raids on Darwin, and numerous actions in the East Indies and Coral Sea. He was an experienced pilot by any standard, but the weeks since Midway had pushed him beyond the limits of endurance. Between June 6th and June 10th, Zuho's air group flew continuous operations covering the fleet's withdrawal. Combat air patrols launched every 2 hours. Search missions ranged 200 miles from the fleet. Strike missions attacked American submarines and surface forces attempting to close for torpedo attacks. The remaining pilots flew 4, sometimes 5 missions daily, catching sleep in brief intervals between flights. Narusawa's flight log, recovered decades later from Japanese archives, documented the exhaustion. June 6th, 3 combat air patrols, total flight time 6.2 hours. June 7th, 2 caps, 1 search mission, 1 strike against submarine contact, total flight time 7.8 hours. June 8th, 4 caps, total flight time 8.1 hours. June 9th, 1 search, 2 caps, 1 strike mission, total flight time 6.9 hours. By June 10th, Narusawa had flown 29.0 hours in 5 days, averaging nearly 6 hours daily in a single-seat fighter with no autopilot, requiring constant physical input and mental alertness. Flight surgeons would later testify that such operational tempo created cumulative exhaustion that degraded judgment and created vulnerability to errors that rested pilots would never make. June 10, 1942, 4:40 p.m. Narusawa launched from Zuhio on what was scheduled as a routine combat air patrol. The mission called for maintaining station 30 miles ahead of the fleet for 90 minutes, then returning to the carrier. Standard procedure, executed hundreds of times. But this mission included a complication. Zuhio was operating as part of a dispersed formation. The carrier maintained separation from the cruisers and destroyers to reduce vulnerability to submarine attack. The fleet's course was 345 degrees, roughly northwest, at 24 knots. Wind was from the east at 15 knots. Cloud cover was scattered at 3,000 feet with visibility of 15 miles. Narusawa's patrol station was designated as bearing 015 degrees from Zuhio, distance 30 miles. He was to orbit that point for 90 minutes, then return on reciprocal bearing 195 degrees. The navigation was simple. Fly outbound for approximately 15 minutes to station, orbit for 90 minutes, fly inbound for 15 minutes. Total mission time, 2 hours. Fuel endurance in a Zero at cruise power, approximately 3.5 hours. The patrol was uneventful. Narusawa orbited his assigned station, seeing nothing but ocean and scattered clouds. No enemy aircraft, no surface contacts. After 90 minutes, he turned to heading 195 degrees and began the return flight to Zuhio. This is where the error occurred. Narusawa assumed Zuhio had maintained course 345 degrees during his patrol, but the carrier had altered course to 290 degrees, roughly west, 40 minutes into his patrol, to avoid a reported submarine contact. The course change was radioed to patrolling aircraft, but Narusawa's radio had been experiencing intermittent problems since the previous day. He never received the message. The navigational error was simple but catastrophic. Narusawa flew heading 195 degrees, expecting to intercept Zuhio's track. But Zuhio was now 40 miles west of where he expected. His reciprocal course took him toward where the carrier had been, not where it was. The error compounded with each passing minute. After 20 minutes on heading 195 degrees, Narasawa should have spotted Zuhio. He saw nothing but empty ocean and scattered clouds. No enemy aircraft, no surface contacts. After 40 minutes, his fuel gauge showed less than 1 hour remaining. After 60 minutes, less than 30 minutes. Narasawa faced a decision faced by countless naval aviators throughout history. Continue searching for his carrier and likely run out of fuel over the ocean, or find any flat surface and attempt to land before fuel exhaustion forced him to ditch at sea. Then he spotted them, aircraft in landing pattern, following standard carrier approach procedures, and beneath them a carrier steaming into the wind, recovering aircraft. Distance approximately 20 miles. Narasawa didn't realize it wasn't Zuhio. The carrier looked right. Island superstructure on starboard side, angled flight deck, aircraft recovering. Through the haze and the fatigue and the desperation of a pilot running out of fuel far from home, it looked like salvation. He entered the landing pattern behind the last recovering aircraft, lowered his landing gear, extended his tailhook, configured his Zero for carrier landing exactly as he'd done hundreds of times before. The muscle memory of repeated training took over, suppressing the higher cognitive functions that might have noticed the details that didn't match. The aircraft ahead of him landed. The deck was clear. The landing signal officer, clearly visible on his platform, paddles in hand, guided him down. Narasawa followed the signals, flying the approach exactly as trained, corrected for lineup, adjusted his rate of descent, cut throttle at the signal. The Zero touched down on USS Enterprise's flight deck at 1847 hours, June 10, 1942. The tail hook engaged the number 3 arresting wire. The aircraft jerked to a halt in less than 150 feet. Narasawa sat in his cockpit, hands still on the controls, and looked around at the flight deck crew rushing toward his aircraft. That's when he realized they weren't Japanese. The Americans wore different uniforms, spoke a different language, and they were pointing rifles at his aircraft. The recognition was mutual and instantaneous. For perhaps 5 seconds, nobody moved. The absurdity was so complete that standard procedures didn't exist. Narasawa wasn't attacking. He was just sitting in his cockpit, clearly as stunned as everyone else. The deck crew wasn't sure whether to treat this as a combat situation or what. Prisoner reception? There was no protocol for enemy pilots voluntarily landing on your carrier. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, Enterprise's flight deck officer, was the first to react. He drew his service pistol and approached the Zero, signaling for the pilot to shut down his engine and exit the aircraft. Narasawa, recognizing that any aggressive action would result in immediate death, complied. He shut down the engine, unfastened his harness, and carefully climbed out of the cockpit, keeping his hands visible. Bruno Gaido, still watching from the catwalk, would later describe the scene to intelligence officers. The Jap just sat there looking around like he was trying to figure out what happened. Then he saw us, and his whole face changed. You could see the moment he realized where he was. He looked, I don't know, scared, confused, and maybe a little embarrassed, like he'd walked into the wrong bathroom or something. Except it was way more serious than that. Marines assigned to the carrier's security detachment arrived and took Narasawa into custody. He was searched, disarmed of his sidearm and survival knife, and escorted below decks to the ship's brig. The entire evolution, from touchdown to detention, took less than 4 minutes. The flight deck was cleared, and normal operations resumed. But what remained on the flight deck was one of the most significant intelligence prizes of the Pacific War to that date: an intact, operational Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter, the aircraft that had dominated Pacific air combat for 6 months. The fighter that had destroyed more Allied aircraft than any other Japanese type. And the Americans now had one, undamaged, delivered by its own pilot. The intelligence exploitation of Narusawa's Zero provided insights that would shape American fighter development and tactics for the remainder of the war. But to understand the significance, you need to understand what American intelligence knew and didn't know about the Zero before June 10, 1942. The Mitsubishi A6M had been designed in 1938 to 1939 by a team led by Jiro Horikoshi to meet an Imperial Japanese Navy requirement for a carrier-based fighter with unprecedented range and maneuverability. The specifications were so demanding that most Japanese manufacturers declined to bid, considering the requirements impossible to meet simultaneously. Horikoshi's solution was radical: minimize weight through every possible means. The airframe used aluminum alloy throughout, with no armor protection for the pilot or fuel tanks. The structure was designed to minimum stress margins, sacrificing durability for lightness. The engine, a Nakajima Sakai producing 940 horsepower, was relatively small, but sufficient given the aircraft's light weight of 3,704 pounds empty. The result was an aircraft with performance that seemed impossible by Western standards. Maximum speed, 332 miles per hour. Service ceiling, 33,000 feet. Range with external drop tank, 1,929 miles. Rate of climb, 3,100 feet per minute. Wing loading, just 23.4 pounds per square foot, giving it maneuverability that exceeded every Allied fighter. The Zero entered service in 1940 and quickly established dominance. In China, Zeros massacred Soviet-supplied I-15 and I-16 fighters. At Pearl Harbor, Zeros provided air superiority that allowed Japanese bombers to operate unmolested. In the Philippines, Netherlands, East Indies, and Malaya, Zeros destroyed Allied air forces with loss ratios exceeding 10-1. American intelligence knew the Zero was formidable, but lacked specific data on its capabilities and limitations. Pilots who encountered Zeros reported that the aircraft could outturn anything the Allies flew, could climb faster than American fighters, and had range that allowed it to escort bombers on missions American fighters couldn't match. But hard performance data was scarce. Most encounters ended with Allied aircraft destroyed, leaving few survivors to provide detailed observations. What intelligence officers suspected but couldn't confirm was that the Zero's performance came at a cost. The lack of armor protection suggested vulnerability to battle damage. The light structure suggested potential weakness under high-G maneuvers. The emphasis on maneuverability over speed suggested possible limitations in dive performance. These were educated guesses based on engineering principles. But intelligence assessments based on theory are fundamentally different from assessments based on examining actual hardware. Theory could be wrong. Hardware didn't lie. June 11, 1942, 0800 hours. Hangar deck, USS Enterprise. Commander James Tatch, commanding officer of Fighting Squadron 3, VF-3, stood next to Narusawa Zero, examining the aircraft with fascination. Tatch, a naval aviator with 12 years' service and a graduate of the Navy's Test Pilot School, was uniquely qualified to understand what he was seeing. The Zero was immediately moved to the hangar deck and secured under guard. Enterprise's engineering department began detailed examination while the carrier steamed toward Pearl Harbor. Tatch personally supervised the inspection, documenting every detail that might provide tactical advantage. The weight was the first revelation. Using the hangar deck scales, they determined the Zero's empty weight, 3,704 pounds. Tatch's F-4F Wildcat weighed 5,785 pounds empty, 56% heavier. The weight difference explained much of the Zero's performance advantage. Lower weight meant better acceleration, climb rate, and maneuverability, with equivalent or even lower engine power. The structure was the second revelation. Removing inspection panels revealed an airframe built to minimum margins. Structural members were thinner than equivalent American construction. Fasteners were smaller and spaced wider. The skin was thinner gauge aluminum. Everything about the structure prioritized lightweight over durability. Thatch's engineering report, declassified in 1983, documented findings methodically. Aircraft structure exhibits excellent design optimization for weight reduction. However, structural margins appear minimal. Estimate airframe can withstand approximately 6 to 7 G maximum before structural failure. American fighters, designed for 9 to 12 G loads, recommend exploitation of this limitation through high G maneuvers that Zero cannot follow. The fuel system revealed critical vulnerabilities. The Zero carried fuel in multiple tanks in the wings and fuselage, none of which were self-sealing. American fighters had adopted self-sealing fuel tanks in 1940, using rubber compounds that swelled when penetrated by projectiles, sealing bullet holes and preventing fuel leakage. The Zero had no such protection. Any hit on a fuel tank would cause leakage and potentially fire. The pilot protection was equally revealing. No armor plate behind the pilot, no armored glass windscreen, no protection beneath the cockpit floor. The pilot sat in an aluminum bathtub, protected from below only by thin metal and the engine. Any rounds penetrating from behind, below, or the sides would hit the pilot directly. The armament was sophisticated. Two 20mm Type 99 cannons in the wings, each with 60 rounds, and two 7.7mm Type 97 machine guns in the fuselage with 500 rounds each. The cannons provided heavy firepower capable of destroying bombers with few hits, but the ammunition load was limited. A Zero pilot had approximately 7 seconds of cannon fire before exhausting ammunition. American fighters carried ammunition for 30+ seconds of sustained fire. The engineering examination produced a comprehensive assessment that was distributed to all Pacific Fleet fighter squadrons within 2 weeks. The report's tactical recommendations would fundamentally change how American pilots fought Zeros. Do not attempt to turn with Zeros. Their wing loading and lightweight provide maneuverability advantage that cannot be matched. Use boom and zoom tactics. Dive from altitude, attack, extend away using speed advantage. Use high G maneuvers if caught in turning fight. The Zero's light structure limits maneuvering to approximately 6 to 7 G. American fighters can sustain 9+ G. Execute hard brakes that force Zero pilot to either follow and risk structural failure or break off attack. Attack from behind and below when possible. Lack of armor protection makes pilot vulnerable. Concentrate fire on cockpit area for maximum effect. Target fuel tanks in the wings. Lack of self-sealing tanks means any fuel system hit will cause leakage. Sustained fire into wing root area likely to cause fire. Extend in dives. The Zero's lightweight and design for low-speed maneuverability limits dive speed. American fighters can dive away and Zero cannot follow. Fight with altitude advantage. Zero performs best at low and medium altitudes. Maintain altitude advantage, attack from above, extend to altitude after each pass. These tactics, disseminated throughout Pacific Fleet aviation, marked the beginning of the end for the Zero's dominance. American pilots no longer fought on the Zero's terms. They exploited the aircraft's weaknesses ruthlessly, using tactics the engineering examination had revealed. But the intelligence value extended beyond tactics. The Zero provided American engineers with detailed understanding of Japanese manufacturing capabilities, materials technology, and design philosophy. This information shaped American fighter development programs that were still in preliminary design stages. It revealed that Japanese aluminum alloys were comparable to American equivalents, but Japanese manufacturing techniques emphasized hand-fitting and craftsmanship over interchangeable parts and standardized production. Panel fasteners showed evidence of hand finishing. Control cables were individually adjusted rather than using standard lengths. Engine mounting points required custom shimming rather than precision machining. This suggested that Japanese aircraft production, while capable of producing high-quality individual aircraft, would struggle to achieve mass production that characterized American industry. Each Zero required more man-hours to build than American fighters, limiting production rates even if industrial capacity was available. American intelligence analysts concluded that Japan could not replace Zero losses at rates comparable to American fighter production. Each Zero lost was irreplaceable in practical terms, while America could lose 10 F-4Fs and replace them with 20. The war of attrition would favor America, assuming American pilots survived long enough to impose that attrition. The tactics derived from examining Narusawa Zero proved their worth rapidly. By August 1942, American fighter squadrons implementing the new tactics were achieving improved exchange ratios against Zeros. The dramatic losses of early war gradually reversed. By mid-1943, American pilots were achieving parity. By 1944, American fighters dominated Pacific skies. But what of Yoshio Narasawa, the pilot whose navigational error had provided this intelligence windfall? Narasawa was transferred to a prisoner of war facility in Hawaii on June 15, 1942, then moved to a permanent POW camp in California in August. His interrogation by naval intelligence officers provided valuable information about Japanese carrier operations, pilot training, and tactical doctrine. The interrogation reports, declassified in 1995, reveal a pilot who was professional, cooperative, within the limits of his obligations under military law, and remarkably analytical about his own error. Narasawa explained the navigational mistake clearly, detailing how the missed radio call, the course change, and his own exhaustion had combined to create the circumstances that led to his landing on Enterprise. When asked why he didn't realize he was approaching the wrong carrier, Narasawa's response was illuminating. "I was very tired. I had been flying many hours for many days. When I saw a carrier with aircraft landing, my mind accepted what I wanted to see. I wanted to see Zuhio. So I saw Zuhio. The details that would have told me this was an American carrier I did not process. My training took over. I flew the approach, I landed. Only after I landed did I realize my mistake." The interrogation revealed other valuable information. Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized aggressive offensive operations with minimal defensive posture. The loss of 4 fleet carriers at Midway had shocked the Imperial Navy's command structure, but Japanese naval doctrine was already adapting, emphasizing quality over quantity, better pilot training, and improved aircraft. Narasawa described the intensive training program he had completed: 300 hours of flight training before assignment to carrier fighters, then 200-plus hours of carrier-specific training, including day and night landing practice, navigation over water, and aerial combat tactics. The training produced exceptionally skilled pilots, but the time required meant that replacing combat losses took 12 to 18 months. American pilot training, by contrast, had accelerated to meet wartime demands. By late 1942, pilots were completing training in 6 to 9 months, arriving at operational squadrons with fewer total flight hours than Japanese pilots, but in vastly greater numbers. The quality differential was offset by quantity and improving aircraft. Narasawa spent the remainder of the war in POW camps in California and Texas, where he worked in agricultural labor details and was generally regarded as a model prisoner. Post-war, he returned to Japan and lived quietly until he died in 1987 at age 68. He never publicly discussed his landing on Enterprise, considering the incident a personal embarrassment. But the intelligence value of that accidental landing continued to pay dividends throughout the war. The tactical recommendations derived from examining his Zero were updated and refined as more Zeros were captured or recovered. By 1943, American intelligence had such a complete understanding of Zero capabilities that new fighter designs specifically incorporated features to exploit Zero weaknesses. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, entering service in early 1943, was designed partly based on intelligence from captured Zeros. The Hellcat was heavier and less maneuverable than the Zero, but faster in level flight and much faster in dives. It could absorb battle damage that would destroy a Zero. And critically, it was designed for mass production. Over 12,000 Hellcats would be built compared to 10,939 Zeros produced during the entire war. The Vought F-4U Corsair, also entering service in 1943, took the approach even further. Faster than the Hellcat, with better climbing performance and heavier armament, the Corsair was designed explicitly to fight using boom and zoom tactics that exploited the Zero's limitations. Corsair pilots were trained never to turn with Zeros, always maintaining energy advantage, attacking from altitude and extending away using superior speed. These aircraft, combined with the tactics derived from studying Narasawa's Zero, systematically destroyed Japanese naval aviation. The kill ratios reversed. By 1944, American fighters were achieving 10-to-1 kill ratios against Japanese aircraft. The Zero, which had dominated in 1941-42, was outclassed by 1943 and obsolete by 1944. Japan attempted to develop improved fighters to counter American advances. The A6M Zero variant introduced in 1943 had slightly better dive performance and stronger wing structure. The Kawanishi N1K George, introduced in 1943, had performance comparable to American fighters. The Mitsubishi J2M Jack, entering service in 1944, was faster than any American fighter then deployed. But none of these aircraft appeared in sufficient numbers to change the outcome. American industrial capacity produced fighters faster than Japan could destroy them. American pilot training graduated replacement pilots faster than Japan could kill them. And American tactics, refined through examination of captured aircraft and combat experience, consistently exploited Japanese weaknesses. The statistical trajectory of the air war in the Pacific tells the story clearly. 1941-42. Japanese kill ratios approximately 3-to-1 to 10-to-1 in their favor. 1943. Kill ratios approaching parity, roughly 1-to-1. 1944. American kill ratios 5-to-1 to 10-to-1 in their favor. 1945. American kill ratios exceeding 15-to-1. The transformation from Japanese dominance to American overwhelming superiority took 3 years. Multiple factors contributed: better aircraft, better tactics, better training, better numbers. But the intelligence foundation for that transformation began with one exhausted Japanese pilot making a navigational error that put him in the landing pattern behind American aircraft he mistook for friendly. The broader lesson extended beyond immediate tactical intelligence. Narasawa's accidental landing demonstrated the importance of technical intelligence in modern warfare. Examining enemy equipment provided insights that could not be obtained through observation in combat or theoretical analysis. The physical reality of hardware revealed capabilities, limitations, and vulnerabilities that shaped effective countermeasures. American intelligence services became increasingly sophisticated in exploiting captured equipment throughout the war. Japanese aircraft were systematically examined, tested, and their characteristics disseminated to combat units. The same process was applied to German aircraft in Europe. The intelligence gained shaped aircraft design, tactics, and training in ways that provided concrete operational advantages. The Japanese, ironically, failed to implement similar systematic technical intelligence exploitation. When they captured American aircraft, examinations were less thorough, findings were not widely disseminated, and the intelligence rarely influenced Japanese fighter development or tactics. This failure to learn from enemy equipment contributed to Japan's declining aerial combat effectiveness as the war progressed. The incident also highlighted the human element of war. Narusawa was not a poor pilot. He was an experienced aviator who made an understandable error under conditions of extreme fatigue. The American deck crew didn't shoot him immediately because the situation was so unexpected that their training didn't provide clear guidance. Both sides acted professionally in circumstances that neither had anticipated. This humanity in the midst of total war was rare, but not unique. Throughout the Pacific War, instances occurred where combat gave way to mercy, where enemies became prisoners with rights, where the machinery of war paused to accommodate the reality that both sides were human. Narusawa's capture exemplified this paradox, mortal enemies cooperating through the mechanical motions of carrier landing procedures, violence suspended by mutual incomprehension. Post-war analysis of the incident by military historians and human factors specialists identified several contributing factors that made the error possible. Fatigue. Narusawa had flown 29 hours in 5 days, creating cumulative exhaustion that degraded cognitive function and judgment. Sleep deprivation impairs decision-making in measurable ways, increasing error rates and reducing situational awareness. Expectation bias. Narusawa expected to find his carrier. When he saw a carrier, his mind interpreted ambiguous information to match expectations rather than objectively assessing what he was seeing. This confirmation bias is a well-documented cognitive error that increases under stress and fatigue. Similar procedures. Japanese and American carrier landing procedures were remarkably similar, both derived from common pre-war naval aviation practices. Landing signal officers used similar paddle signals. Landing patterns followed similar geometries. This procedural similarity meant that Narusawa could follow the approach without recognizing he was landing on the wrong carrier. Environmental factors. The late afternoon lighting, scattered clouds, and haze reduced visibility and made aircraft identification difficult. The similar size and configuration of Essex-class American carriers and Japanese fleet carriers meant that from a distance they could be confused, especially by fatigued pilots looking for what they expected to see. Communication failure. The missed radio call informing of the course change was the proximate cause of the navigational error. If Narusawa had received that transmission, he would have corrected his return course and likely found Zuifo. The radio malfunction created the initial error that all subsequent events flowed from. Modern carrier operations incorporate multiple redundant navigation systems that make such errors nearly impossible. GPS navigation, tactical data links, and automated identification systems ensure that pilots always know where their carrier is and can distinguish friendly from enemy vessels at distances measured in hundreds of miles. But in 1942, pilots navigated by dead reckoning, compass heading, and visual identification. Errors were inevitable. The specific error Narusawa made, landing on the wrong carrier, was unique in its consequences but not in its possibility. Throughout carrier warfare, pilots occasionally became disoriented and required assistance finding their carriers. Most times this resulted in emergency landings at alternate fields or water ditching. Narusawa's error led to landing on an enemy carrier, an outcome so improbable that nobody had planned for it. The statistical probability of such an event is worth considering. In June 1942, there were approximately 8 operational carriers in the Pacific, 3 American, 5 Japanese. The probability that a lost Japanese pilot would encounter an American carrier rather than his own or another Japanese carrier was roughly 3/8, or 37.5%. But this assumes equal distribution across the vast Pacific, which wasn't the case. Carriers operated in task groups, separated by hundreds of miles. The probability that a Japanese pilot would encounter an American carrier in the specific moment he was looking for his own carrier was infinitesimally small. Yet it happened. The improbable became actual, and the consequences rippled through the remainder of the war in ways that Narusawa, sitting in his Zero's cockpit looking at American deck crew pointing rifles at him, could never have imagined. June 10, 1942, was not a decisive day in the Pacific War. No great battle was fought. No strategic objective was achieved or lost. It was just another day of operations, carriers maneuvering, aircraft patrolling, sailors and aviators performing the routines that constituted naval warfare in the vast Pacific. Except that on this particular day, an exhausted Japanese pilot made a navigational error that put him in the landing pattern behind American aircraft. And because he was too tired to recognize his error, because carrier landing procedures were universal, because nobody on the American carrier could believe what they were seeing until it was too late to prevent it, he landed. The moment of recognition, when Narusawa saw American uniforms and Americans saw Japanese markings, lasted perhaps 5 seconds. 5 seconds when reality contradicted all expectations so completely that neither side knew how to react. Then training took over. Narusawa surrendered. Americans took him prisoner. The war continued. But in those 5 seconds, something extraordinary occurred. Enemies who should have been shooting at each other instead completed a cooperative action, carrier landing operations, that required precise coordination between pilot and landing signals officer. The LSO guided an enemy aircraft aboard using the same signals he used for friendly aircraft. Narusawa followed those signals exactly as he would have for a Japanese carrier. Neither deviated from the procedures both had trained for. In the midst of total war, where the objective was the annihilation of enemy forces, 2 professionals from opposing nations executed a technical procedure with perfect cooperation. Not because they chose cooperation over conflict, but because the procedure was so ingrained, so automatic, that it occurred before conscious minds processed the implications. This moment, this absurd, surreal, impossible moment, captures something essential about war that official histories often miss. War is not constant violence. It's long periods of routine punctuated by moments of terror, occasionally interrupted by moments of complete absurdity, where the machinery of war produces outcomes nobody anticipated. The Japanese pilot landed on an American carrier by accident because he was human, and humans make errors. The American crew accepted his landing because they were professionals, and professionals follow procedures even when circumstances confound understanding. The intelligence value of the captured Zero shaped the remainder of the Pacific Air War because organizations learn from opportunities when chance provides them. In 1985, the Naval Aviation Museum at Pensacola, Florida, opened an exhibit on the Pacific Air War. The centerpiece was a restored A6M Zero, one of several captured during the war. The placard didn't specify which Zero it was, but museum staff confirmed it was Narusawa's aircraft, recovered from Enterprise and eventually transferred to the museum after years in storage. Visitors to the museum can stand next to the aircraft that accidentally landed on an American carrier. The Zero looks small, fragile, and elegant in its simplicity. The thin aluminum skin, the lightweight construction, the minimal pilot protection, all visible to anyone who looks closely. The engineering compromises that provided exceptional performance at the cost of survivability are evident in the hardware. But the placard doesn't tell the full story. It mentions the capture, notes the intelligence value, and lists the specifications. It doesn't mention the exhaustion, the terror, the 5 seconds of mutual incomprehension, the absurdity of enemies cooperating in their confusion. Those human elements aren't preserved in museums. They exist only in the memories of participants, most of whom are dead, and in the interrogation reports and declassified documents that few people read. Yoshio Narusawa flew one of the most advanced fighters of 1942 and made a navigational error that veteran pilots had made throughout aviation history. His error, through pure chance, put him in the landing pattern behind American aircraft, leading to the most unexpected prisoner capture of the Pacific War. He handed American intelligence the exact information they needed to defeat the Zero. He survived the war and returned home, carrying the embarrassment of his error for the rest of his life. And he never knew that his mistake, his moment of exhaustion and confusion and desperate hope that he'd found his carrier, had helped win the war. The crew couldn't believe their eyes. Neither could he. But the Zero landed anyway, and the Pacific Air War turned on the intelligence that the accident provided. Sometimes history pivots on great battles and strategic decisions. Sometimes it pivots on one exhausted pilot making a navigational error. And sometimes the most significant victories are won not through violence, but through the simple act of accepting surrender from an enemy who landed on your carrier by accident. The absurdity was complete. The consequences were profound. And decades later, historians studying the Pacific Air War would trace the transformation from Japanese dominance to American superiority back to June 10, 1942, when a lost pilot saw what he wanted to see and landed where he shouldn't have been. The thunder of war had paused for 5 seconds of mutual incomprehension. Then it continued, but everything had changed.